Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Eon podcast. We're joined in today by Mouin Rabbani, a Dutch Palestinian expert, a Middle East expert and analyst. He's a co editor for Jadaliyya,
Yes.
and you're also a fellow at the. I'm sorry, I'm going to bungle up the words. Can you repeat them?
Yes, non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian
Studies, and you're currently based out of Montreal. Mouin,
I'm currently visiting Montreal.
you're
that's
visiting
correct.
Montreal, right? Thank you
Yeah.
for joining us on the program.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Everybody's seen your work online. Hopefully, I suspect that the younger members of our audience will have seen your debate with Destiny and the other gentleman, where you were alongside
Benny Morris.
Benny Morris, yes, where you were alongside Mr. Finkelstein. How was that experience? And would you say that those two people characterize the Zionist tendencies within the West very well? Was that an encapsulation of what it's like?
Well, I think Benny Morris gave a fairly accurate rendition of, let's say, mainstream Zionist thinking, Israeli thinking regarding recent developments, stating explicitly that international law is irrelevant, making points about history that he feels completely justifies Israel throughout that history, and particularly what it's doing now. Bonnell, whose stage name is Destiny, was, I think, really there and invited by the host for the clicks. This is someone whose level of knowledge is appallingly low. And if you look at the comments on the video, there's people who came out in support of the Israeli view, people who came out in support of the Palestinian view, but the one comment that seems to have generated, let's say, more conclusions than any other is that Bonnell really shouldn't have been there. That that there was no justification for including him in what was supposed to be an adult conversation.
Yeah, I suspect that there's been a concerted effort to convert the Palestinian genocide that is going on into a sort of a hot topic debate issue as opposed to a serious conversation that adults need to have. There's
That's
been a
right.
concerted effort on the Zionist end, I think, to finance debate nerds or debate lords, as they are referred to online. Like they're sort of these autist characters who will debate religion, and I think it's coming from the greater strain of the new atheism that we saw in the early 2000s, which somehow ended up cheerleading the Iraq and Afghan war with Hitchens and the late Christopher Hitchens and the Sam Harris characters of the world, who I think, funnily enough, has also cheerleaded the genocide that is going on in Gaza. So it's a continuation of that strain to convert this into a hot topic debate issue, to delay the actual scrutiny that needs to come down on Israel, so that Israel can deny the Al Hilli hospital, for example, until it doesn't. Just to keep,
Well, yeah, and what's interesting now is they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I mean, promoting people like Bonnell, like Dr. Phil, these bots operating out of India, whose primary purpose seems to be to participate in the Netanyahu personality cult and issue an endless stream of frankly genocidal tweets. So I don't think it's going particularly well for Israeli Hasbara, as it's called. What I call the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra has really been playing out of tune, particularly for the past 18, 19 months, which is quite telling when you consider how effective they were in decades past. There's really no comparison. I mean, in Israel's defense, it's a message. The message of genocide is a very, very tough sell. But even taking that into account, the people that they're supporting to transmit their message are really not the cream of the crop, let's say.
That's a really fascinating observation, and I think this time around, even Muslims across the world, people in the global south, have been shocked by the level of the lack of control that the Israeli narrative has enjoyed, which historically, like you mentioned, has been the Holocaust narrative has been dominant and at the forefront of any mention of genocide or of ethnic displacement of the Palestinian people. Like I said, they would usually dominate the 48-hour, 72-hour news window until the issue had passed. But this time, what are the factors do you think that are different that the global south, the global left, the Palestinian narrative, it has been able to maintain a sort of relevance in the public domain and has cut through the noise of this bottom of the barrel propaganda?
It's a very interesting question. I think there are several factors. I think first and most importantly, it's simply what Israel is doing. I mean, it's a blatant, in your face genocide, where Israeli public opinion and Israeli politics have shifted so far to the extreme right that it would violate their moral code to keep pretending, that they support peace, that they're trying to achieve peace, and so on, as they would do in decades past while conducting various war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 2023, 24, 25, they're openly celebrating their crimes, and this makes it much more difficult to justify and rationalize and market them. A second one is that with the diffusion of media, we're no longer solely reliant on the BBC and CNN and the New York Times and what's called legacy corporate media. They've been caught marketing blatant falsehoods about a number of very serious incidents on a regular basis. And this, of course, has affected their credibility regarding their criminality. A third one, of course, is that, and this is not often raised in the mainstream media, but Israel has not only systematically prevented foreign journalists from entering the Gaza Strip to report on what's happening, making it transparently obvious that there's a lot going on that they're determined to cover up. But they've also been hunting down Palestinian journalists who have been performing heroically for the past 18 months. They're literally hunting them down and assassinating them. Most recently, bombing a burn unit in a hospital for the express purpose of killing a journalist who was being treated in that burn unit. And the other factor, of course, is the diffusion of social media, as many have noted. This is the first live-streamed genocide in history. If you go back even a few decades to Bosnia or Rwanda, it was something we would read about in the newspapers or see reports about after it had happened. Right. Here, we're getting live images 24/7 for a year and a half, and that's clearly affected global public opinion. I mean, you look at a place like the United States, where the default position had among not only the political class, but also among public opinion, had been either support for Israel or to give Israel the benefit of the doubt. That no longer exists. 40 years ago, pro-Palestinian activists on American university campuses were an endangered species. Today, it's those who are coming out in open support of Israel and its genocidal campaign who are very much in the minority.
Right. Now I think it's become such a potent threat that the American empire has to roll out deportations and Alcatraz threats and threats of being sent to an offshore Venezuelan prison with the is it Venezuela or is it Puerto Rico?
El Salvador.
El Salvador. So Salvadorian prison. I'm so sorry.
Who's of Palestinian origin, by the way.
Who is of Palestinian origin, exactly.
Najib Bukele.
Bukele, I think, is we can agree, is the worst Palestinian that has ever existed.
Well, there's competition for that title, but yes, sure. he's up there.
Fair enough. So we also have the son of Hamas character.
Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's been a complete media blackout in Gaza, but with mainstream media at least. And historically, the organized tours like you had with people like Douglas Murray, those kinds of visuals would usually sway the public opinion in the West historically. But I think the presence of alternative media sources has allowed people to cut through the Hasbara symphony, as you put it. And is it just this distrust or mistrust in institutional media and institutions, or is there something unique in comparison to the Iraq or Afghan wars? Because
I
those were
think it's
right.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's both. Obviously, the way that the mainstream media actively and, in my view, knowingly promoted a whole panoply of falsehoods about Iraq in the run up to the 2003 invasion and occupation of that country helped to shatter public trust in the media. I mean, certainly, if you compare it, for example, to trust in the U.S. media during the war in Vietnam, for example. And I think people increasingly view the corporate media as a mouthpiece for government, as a mouthpiece for the corporations that own them, and trust is very much reduced in both the media and the political class more generally. But also, I mean, if you compare Gaza to Iraq, for example, I mean, it's again, we're talking here about a live streamed genocide. I mean, Iraq was only 2 decades ago, but the availability of real time media about what is actually happening and what is happening on a very granular level, because we're constantly inundated with these images, with these video clips and so on, I think is really having an impact. And if you look at the response, on the one hand, Israel and its flunkies not only celebrating what's doing, but then also trying to convince you that this is Pallywood, this is Gaza wood, this is
Right.
not actually happening. I mean, now they're trying to convince us that there is and should be a medieval siege on the Gaza Strip. But it's absolutely not resulting in any form of malnutrition or starvation, let alone famine. And you have now this absolutely vile, repellent organization in Great Britain, UK Lawyers for Israel, whose previous claim to fame was forcing a children's hospital to take down art produced by Palestinian children, now openly writing letters that the siege is actually good for the health of its victims. Imagine, first of all, having the shameless audacity to make this argument, and second of all, that this argument was signed off on by the heads of this organization, who felt it was a winning argument, a persuasive point to make. That's how far off the deep end these people are. They've become complacent because they've never been challenged. They've become complacent and drunk with power, and now they're paying the price. And how are they responding? Well, when you have to resort to criminalizing dissent, when you have to resort to what I would call Gestapo tactics of grabbing people off the street because they've co-authored an opinion piece in an obscure student newspaper that maybe 50 people have read. When you're grabbing people off the street by by agents in civilian clothes and so on, that shows that you've lost the argument. That shows that you understand you can no longer convince public opinion, and the only option you have left is to criminalize public opinion, to bully public opinion, to pass laws and take actions to force public opinion, if not to agree with you, at least not to take any actions on the basis of their convictions. It's, Israel is a lost cause now. Of course, it retains enormous support among Western governments. Its impunity is assured, and all the rest of it. I mean, the European countries have made very clear that they will do nothing to enforce the International Criminal Court arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. But the battle for public opinion has been lost, I think irrevocably so.
Right, that's the follow-up question I wanted to ask you, is that the heavy-handedness that the Israeli media narrative has adopted is now, it's not only providing diminishing returns, it's become counterintuitive and counterproductive. Is it hubris that they've not realized and course corrected, or do you think they're unsalvageable at this point in terms of having any a positive impact on the mediascape or on public consciousness?
I think it's both. I think hubris helps explain the initial approach, that we don't even have to go through the motions of trying to convince you, because we have the support of Biden, of von der Leyen, of Starmer and his predecessor, whose name escapes me for the moment. But it's also, I think, a genuine fear that a point of no return has been reached, and that the only effective tactic left to keep not only global publics, but especially Western publics in line is bullying and intimidation. I mean, we're now reaching a threshold where you're beginning to see mainstream corporate media, the Financial Times, followed by the Independent, and now even the Guardian, explicitly using the word genocide to characterize what Israel has been doing for the past year and a half. That's a Rubicon, I believe. When you begin to lose the mainstream media, which generally functions as a mouthpiece for official policy, that may well represent the beginnings of a turning point.
Right. And is it a sign of the times that you see Donald Trump sort of posturing in the last 72 odd hours while Pakistan was busy with dealing with its neighborhood Israel? Do you think that there was that the new kind of posturing that the Saudis have pressured maybe Trump into, or bribed him into, with the Qataris, providing him this new state-of-the-art airplane, and then he also showing up and, meeting with Ahmed al-Shara? So much has happened in the last 72 hours, and I don't know what to make of it. But do you see a new normal where maybe we're not living in a post-Abraham Accords world? Maybe we may have to reimagine the idea of a Palestinian state because the Americans are being forced to capitulate. Is this wishful thinking, or is there some reality to this?
Well, I think it's a complex story, and I don't want to engage in triumphalism or false optimism,
Right.
because at the end of the day, given everything that we've been discussing in the last few minutes, Palestinians are still being bombed around the clock with people, especially children, being shredded practically on the hour. The flow of weaponry from the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and so on continues to flow to Israel. The United States, Great Britain, and the European Union have made clear that Israeli impunity remains at the very basis of their foreign policy. But at the same time, we are seeing changes. And these have to do, I think, with the United States beginning to engage with the region and its various actors bilaterally without coordinating with Israel.
Right.
We've seen this in the nuclear negotiations with Iran. We've seen this now with Syria, as you just mentioned. We've even seen it with Hamas
Yes.
This past week. And we've most certainly seen it with Saudi Arabia, where the Trump administration has decided it's no longer willing to wait for Israel to deliver the goods to make Saudi-Israeli normalization possible, and therefore is proceeding bilaterally with a Saudi-U.S. Agreement that serves U.S. interests, but not Israeli interests. So there are significant changes happening, but I would not yet describe these as a crisis in U.S.-Israeli relations, although Israel is certainly experiencing it as such. And these developments will not necessarily benefit the Palestinians, as we've just discussed. But there's also another aspect here that I think is important, which is that for decades now, Israel has used its privileged position in the United States as leverage over its relations with third parties, governments in Africa and Asia and Latin America and so on. It's managed to convince many of these governments that the road to Washington goes through Tel Aviv.
Right.
Make nice with us, and we can make things happen for you in Washington. You cross us, and we can make sure things don't happen for you in Washington.
Right.
This is, of course, reference to the enormous influence that the Israel lobby exercises over the U.S. Congress. Well, it's extremely dangerous for Israel that all these governments are now looking at how the United States is conducting diplomacy in the Middle East on issues that are of core concern to Israel, without even so much as a nod and a wink to Israel. And they will now conclude that actually the road to Washington no longer goes through Tel Aviv, it goes through Riyadh, or we don't even need anybody and we can approach them directly. So that's another element of this issue that I think we need to take into account. But again, I would by no means conclude already today that there is a crisis in U.S.-Israeli relations, or that we're about to see a fundamental transformation of Western policy towards Israel.
Right, that's fair enough. I mean, it's a fair analysis of what's going on. But don't you I mean, we witness, just to comment on your idea of this, India is seen as the replacement market for the Chinese industrial base that the Americans are clearly interested in. And at least in Pakistani public consciousness, as well as our state, there has been a subtle acknowledgement of the fact that the Americans sort of gave them the green light, like they did the Israelis, to prosecute their own, case against Pakistan in the case of Israel against Palestine. And it seems to me that the Indians as well as the Israelis have not been successful, not only in terms of the material gains that they were supposed to make, whether that be in the destruction of or uprooting of Hamas, or the displacement of the Palestinian people from Gaza. Similarly, India has also also been given a bloody nose, maybe. And it seems that America is wanting to take things into their own hands. Even with Pakistan, when discussing the ceasefire, first of all, Trump announced it before anyone else could. He sort of claimed victory for himself. And he also said that the Kashmir issue is yet to be resolved. And that is a big insult to their trading partner, India, which I think they've been... so it's shift overall, I would like to say, in the policy that Trump has been taking up. I wouldn't describe it as a crisis yet, because India is still being armed like Israel. So, but it is a shift nonetheless. And I think India and Israel both are panicking in this regard.
Well, if the U.S. felt that India could replace China in economic terms, I don't think we would have seen the recent U.S.-Chinese negotiations that, for all intents and purposes, eliminated over 90% of the tariffs that Trump had so recently announced. If you have a replacement, why would you roll everything back? I think the case of India is quite tragic. India, as you know, has been a leader in the global South, or was a leader in the global South for decades, even before its independence. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, despite being a global icon of nonviolent non-cooperation and of nonviolence, came out in open support of the Palestinian rebellion against the British during the second half of the 1930s. India voted against partition at the General Assembly in November 1947. And had been a key member of the non-aligned movement, had been a key supporter of the Palestinian cause, of course, along with Pakistan for many decades. But then, unfortunately, in the last few decades, beginning in the 1990s, that began to change, and particularly now with a similar type of ethno-nationalism being adopted by the current Indian leadership. It has become very closely aligned with Israel. I mean, Netanyahu and Modi are effectively two peas in a pod. And as you mentioned, we're now seeing the impact of that alliance in both regions.
अब जो बात है ना वो इससे बहुत आगे जा चुकी है कि ड्रग्स बुरी चीज है या ड्रग्स नहीं करने चाहिए. अब बहस इस मौजू पे होती है कि कौन से ड्रग्स करने चाहिए और कौन से ड्रग्स नहीं करने चाहिए.
एक सीरीज है, इंग्लिश सीरीज है जो कि उसका नाम है ब्रेकिंग बैड. वर्ल्ड मैप पे ये ड्रग जो है उस सीजन के बाद से आई.
When it comes to heroin, तो ये शायद सिनेरियो अब भी यही ट्रू है कि there are a few big guns and then वो spread out करते हैं and वो आपकी streets में आता है पूरे लाहौर के अंदर.
I don't know who these mafias are. They are stronger than the government maybe.
कि अगर मैं आज सच की बात करती हूँ, कल को जब मुझे खुद सच बोलना पड़े तो क्या मैं बोलूंगी? क्या मैं इतनी सच्ची हूं कि मैं अपने सच का नुकसान बर्दाश्त करूं?
Yes, unfortunately, I think India played its hand. India has had secret diplomacy and has paid lip service to the Palestinian cause since the 1950s and 60s. But they've had secret diplomacy with the Israelis from the 70s onward. And in the 90s, the relationship really got cemented after the Kargil incident with Pakistan, where I think Pakistan unwittingly ended up delivering the then non-aligned India to the American imperial project, which I think India is maintained that relationship, particularly doubled down on it during the Obama years, when the Modi and the Hindutva regime was empowered as a potential regional ally. But I think, like with many things, the Quad Alliance, India failed to perform against the Chinese in the Himachal district when the Chinese incurred on disputed territory. It also, the tariff regime failure also reflects that. I think you pointed out quite accurately that this idea of the Chinese industrial base being replaced by India is neither defensible in its position against Pakistan and China, which has been demonstrated a couple of times now, and neither is it a viable market in terms of the skilled labor and the supply chains that the Chinese have managed. So, do you think this kind of increasing multipolarity, which is becoming obvious to the world, where you have Russia being able to maintain against the NATO onslaught in the Ukraine, where you have China cementing its position in South and Central Asia, do you think this kind of multipolarity will allow wiggle room at least, for the Palestinian case, which was being prosecuted through lawfare initially in the so-called international rules-based order, for whatever it is to emerge in the coming years or months? Will Palestine be able to make some room for itself, do you think?
It may, but I think your question is less relevant to the Palestinians than it is to the region as a whole. I mean,
Right.
Let's recall the Cold War, the decades of the Cold War. During the Cold War, you had a clear choice, and you chose one of two options. You were either aligned with the United States and the West, or you were aligned with the Soviet Union and the communist bloc. And that was certainly true for most states in the Middle East, which were identified as either pro-US or pro-Soviet. Then, of course, we had the decade and a half or so of unipolar hyperpower, where you either did as you were told by Washington, or, as in the case of Iraq and Libya, you were invaded and overthrown. That's now changed. I mean, if you look at key states in the Middle East, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and others, they have engaged in a process that I would call strategic diversification. Their primary relationship strategically, maybe with the United States, but that hasn't in any way prevented them from developing increasingly strong relations with other global powers. Think of Russia and OPEC Plus, where Saudi Arabia, despite being a very close Western ally, is its key partner for managing the global energy market is Russia. China is the main purchaser of Gulf oil, not just from Iran, but from all the other states as well. And so they've developed this kind of whole series of relationships based much more on interest than on anything else. And we saw this, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Gulf states, on the whole, didn't sign on to the U.S. efforts to condemn Russia and ostracize it, something that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War, for example. So these changes have been happening. They continue to happen. Have they benefited the Palestinians? I think that's kind of a separate and subordinate issue where we haven't really seen, at least not yet, any significant impact of these global developments. Because Israel, for its part, for example, has developed quite strong relations with Russia and China as well.
Right. What about the lawfare element? Do you think the international law being monopolized by the Western world, now being challenged with like the ICJ prosecution presented by South Africa, do you think that is an avenue that is to be explored more or further, or will yield results potentially? You have the ICC warrants, and they have not been enacted yet.
Well, I think the West has been very clear that they support not international law, but the rules-based international order. And that means that, if you're an adversary or enemy of the West, you have to obey every word and punctuation mark
Like you've mentioned, the Western world is sort of exposed as opposed to ruined the rules-based order or the international law. Instead of challenging it, they sort of just exposed for what it was. But long term, do you think that this kind of abuse that they're demonstrating is going? What kind of effects will it have on international law or the global system itself? I mean, how long can it sustain this way?
Well, that's I think a fundamental question that's also very difficult to answer. I mean, it seems to be the case that the international order, as we've known it since 1945, is disintegrating. It seems to be the case that those who were primarily responsible for establishing this international order are now also the ones primarily responsible for dismantling it because it no longer serves their interests. Will they succeed in doing so? If not, will the international law and institutions emerge strengthened? If they do succeed, what will replace it? Will it be the law of the jungle? Will it be something else? I think those are questions that are very difficult to answer at present.
Right. And do you think that long term, the doctrine of self-defense that the US has set when it comes to justifying aggression or preemptive action, and there has been taken up suit by Israel that they preemptively have to level Gaza for potential Hamas terrorists or whatever, and has been followed in suit by India recently when they escalated over an unverified claim of the recent terrorist attack in Kashmir. Do you think that this doctrine is going to sustain as well, where you can attack quote unquote sovereign territories or invade sovereign territories or occupy sovereign territories under the precedent of a preemptive self-defense action? We saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan.
Well, there are all kinds of doctrines that have now been dead and buried under the rubble of Gaza. I mean, think of responsibility to protect. Where are all the prophets of responsibility to protect during the past 18 months? I haven't heard a peep out of a single one of them. Well, if you can ignore this principle of responsibility to protect that you used to invade and destroy Libya and Iraq and elsewhere, but you can't seem to find it anywhere where there's a live stream genocide that's now over a year and a half old. That means it wasn't much of a principle to begin with. It was an imperial instrument. It no longer exists. No one is even pretending it's serious anymore. Preemptive action, I think that largely died along with the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So yes, states like Israel and India and others still try to invoke it. But I think we've now reached the point where no one takes these claims particularly seriously anymore.
Right. But what does it mean for the conflict? Like we've talked about the situation in the Middle East and the new order that is emerging potentially. What does it mean for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian statehood cause? Because up till now, we have witnessed public opinion being shifted to against Israel and the idea of the Zionist Jewish state. What does it mean for any dissenting voices in Israel or outside Israel trying to prosecute this case for the Palestinian state? Because do you think that the Israelis will be able to continue to occupy Gaza and the West Bank, or do you think they will have to retract on a lot of the actions that they've carried out in the last decade or two?
Well, of course, there are dissenting voices in Israel, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that if you compare the current situation to, for example, Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, or even the first Intifada, those dissenting Israeli voices are increasingly few and far between. Israel has become what I would argue is a genocidal society. It's for the past year and a half, it's been gripped by what a colleague of mine recently referred to as genocide mania. Will Israel be able to continue as it is, or will it collapse under the weight of its own hubris? I think it's premature to answer that question, but I would like to make the following observations. Israel is a fairly small state, limited resources, limited population, and it derives its power ultimately from its role as a proxy for the West in the Middle East. I mean, after all, that's how Israel was established in the first place. Great Britain decided it would serve its interests to have what was called a Jewish Ulster in Palestine. Can Israel continue to fight a forever war in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen? Now, if it has its way against Iran, does it have the wherewithal to do this on a permanent basis, or is this going to lead to a fundamental weakening and perhaps even eventual collapse or civil war or whatnot within the Israeli state? Well, I think as long as Israel retains its role as the West's proxy of choice in the Middle East, it is probably reasonably safe, even if limits are placed on it in certain respects. But once, or if rather, the West begins to perceive Israel as no longer a strategic asset, but rather as a strategic burden, then all bets are off. I certainly wouldn't venture to make a prediction at this point. But if I was in the Israeli leadership, I would certainly be concerned.
Right. So, do you think that concern will force Israel to change its behavior and to act like a good little boy for their Western masters? Because surely they're already becoming a burden on, or they already have become a burden on American foreign policy. And I think this deviation from the norm has been a bit of a demonstration of that, where America has sort of flexed its muscles, even in the case of Israel. So, for example, in the public media scape, I've noticed that even mainstream cheerleaders for the Iraq war, for example, like Tucker Carlson, have openly come out on their own platforms criticizing Israel. Clearly, this kind of opinion making is happening from somewhere deep within the American, collective subconscious, or the deep state even. There is a clear rising not just anti-Zionist sentiment, but genuine anti-Semitism as well. That is, neither of those are, I think, a happenstance. They're very well coordinated and timed. Do you think, in response, the form that Israel has taken up under the Likud party and the far right extremists like Ben Gvir, do you think and the Kahanist movement basically, do you think they have the ability to now turn court and be able to be more obedient and subservient to American desires in the region, or do you think they're going to continue down this path and sort of spiral out?
Well, it's quite remarkable that we're now also beginning to see a growing disillusion with Israel among what has been now for several decades the mainstay of its support in the political system in the United States and Western Europe, which is
neoconservatives, right.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is that there's a shift within sectors of the right, of rather than seeing Israel as a model and Israel as an asset, they now see, for example, how Netanyahu was scheming with the now former U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, to sabotage U.S.-Iranian negotiations and drag the U.S. into an Israeli war against Iran.
Yes.
We need to understand that one development in recent decades is that it is the Democrats who have now assumed the mantle of the war party.
Yes.
And there are important anti-interventionist constituencies now within the Republican Party. And they may support Israel as a matter of principle, but not at the cost of American lives. And here this gets back to your previous question. They're seeing that Israel is incapable of fighting its own wars. I mean, it's been fighting this second-order militia, Hamas, in the Gaza Strip for over a year and a half. You know, it's not the same Israel that defeated three Israeli armies, rather three Arab conventional armies armed by the Soviet Union in 6 days in 1967. I mean, it's still fighting to achieve an elusive victory in the Gaza Strip. And what's its response? It wants the Americans to fight an Israeli war against Iran. And I think that's the core of the disillusionment within sectors of the American rights with Israel. The other thing, of course, is that the Republican Party has become a personality cult. And, you know, these kinds of attacks like we're seeing now on Trump about, you know, accepting this Qatari jet and negotiating with Iran and so on, they don't sit very well with the personality cult when you start denouncing its head and acting like, you know, when Israel accepts billions and billions of dollars and free weapons from the U.S., you know, acting as if it's Israel that's doing the U.S. the favor and not the other way around. So these are all warning signs for Israel. But I would, again, you know, I would not, certainly not yet, describe what we're seeing as either a crisis in U.S.-Israeli relations or somehow a fundamental transformation in U.S.-Israeli relations, right, let alone a realignment in U.S. policy.
But do you think that Israel will be able to react in a way that is beneficial to the entity? Because I think that they might be slow on the uptake. Or is it that you think that the Netanyahu regime is going to become the scapegoat and then it's business as usual?
It's the problem for Israel is not Netanyahu. The problem for Israel is that the entire political spectrum has moved so far to the extreme right that it is no longer capable of acting rationally and pursuing what any mainstream Israeli politician 20 or 30 years ago would have identified as Israel's best interest. I mean, look at how they're responding. You know, they're shrilly denouncing their closest allies and best friends and making all kinds of wild accusations against them. Israel has become an irrational gangster state, to put it quite bluntly. It is no longer capable of cultivating friends and allies in order to strengthen its position against adversaries and enemies. And if Israel continues on this course, which I think is quite likely, it's going to be confronting a real problem.
Right. We can hope and pray that this would benefit the Palestinian people and the cause for the Palestinian state. We've taken up a lot of your time. Mouin, would you like to make some closing remarks with regards to...
No, I think we've pretty much covered it. Thanks very much.
No, thank you, Mouin, for your time, and hopefully we can have you back on with some questions from the audience sometime soonish, inshallah.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
We couldn't get around to your article that you published, but we've already taken too much time up about the Karim Khan stuff and the ICC. But for another time, inshallah. Thank you so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.